Without faith, it is impossible to please God, says Hebrews 11 and verse 6. The letter that we call Hebrews was written to ethnically Jewish people who had become Christians, but they were undergoing fierce persecution. This persecution was driving them to the brink of abandoning Christ altogether and returning to their old way of living under the law of Moses. The book of Hebrews goes through a number of categories which proves that this way of thinking was faulty. Abandoning Christ would be abandoning the whole point of the Old Testament system, which was to show the way to the work of Jesus. Jesus is the fulfillment of the old law, the old tabernacle, the old priesthood, and has brought in something much better, a new and better covenant. Now, in the midst of this argumentation, the writer to the Hebrews calls upon a number of Old Testament examples. He calls them saints. These are men and women of God who underwent great hardships and difficulties and challenges, but through it all remained faithful to the Lord. And the purpose of calling on these Old Testament examples is to show that just as they live by faith in the midst of hardships, so can we. So can we in the midst of great trials and tribulations and challenges. In this chapter, Hebrews 11, we learn about men like Abel and Enoch and Noah. We learn about Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Jacob, and Moses. We learn about the Hebrew children who marched around the city of Jericho, blew trumpets and shouted, and watched the walls come crumbling down. And through it all, these men and women were focused on two great themes. Number one, the Word, the trustworthiness, and the promises of God. And number two, the instructions from God. See, because they had confidence in God's Word, they followed His instructions. And really, that's the definition of the word faith. To trust in God because of what He has done and who He is, and to follow His Word. And so all through this catalog of Old Testament heroes, we see men and women who lived with that in mind. At the very beginning of the chapter, the writer gives us a definition, maybe more an explanation of what faith is. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And in the midst of the chapter, listen to what the writer has to say. Hebrews 11, beginning in verse 13. All these, that is all the Old Testament saints, died in faith, without receiving the promises, but having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. And so they looked beyond their present circumstances. Abraham and Sarah looked beyond the deadness of their bodies and inability to have children. Moses looked beyond the luxuries and the palaces of Egypt. The children of Israel looked beyond those giant walls which fortified the city of Jericho, and through eyes of faith, they saw the promises of God. The world is gripped right now by a terrible and deadly pandemic. And even though COVID-19 coronavirus is going to bring the lives of many people to an end, death is not new, hardships are not new, challenges are not new. In the end, what matters is how we face them. Are we going to be people of faith, just like the men and women we read about in Hebrews 11? Those who look beyond their present circumstances and present hardships to the wonderful, blessed promises of God. In the 12th chapter, after all of this Old Testament discussion, the writer brings it back to Jesus. He says about Jesus. And we look to Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. We look to His example. We look to His trustworthiness, and we look to His promises of a resurrection of our dead bodies and glorification in eternity with Him. Won't you look at your life through the eyes of faith today? Look past your present challenges and difficulties, past this pandemic which has come upon us, but one day will leave. And remember who matters. It's Jesus. If we'll look to Him, He'll walk us through, and we'll be better for it on the other side.